sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to dive into something pretty intense, actually. President Trump's tariff threats against Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, this was a wild one.
It was a real roller coaster, right? You have the markets going crazy, intense negotiations, and then a last-minute pause. So we've got a whole bunch of articles, reports, analyses, and we're going to figure out what actually happened, why it matters, and what it means for you.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here is this isn't just some random event. It actually fits into a much bigger pattern of how the U.S. approaches trade, especially under the Trump administration.
Okay, so let's break it down. Trump comes out swinging, right? Threatens a 25% tariff on imports from both Canada and Mexico, plus a 10% hit on Canadian energy. I mean, can you imagine the scramble businesses must have been trying to figure out supply chains and what this would do to prices?
Yeah, all the think tanks were freaking out, predicting slower economic growth, lower incomes, higher prices for everyone. Not just in the U.S. either. This would have global impact. And that's what makes this so real, right? Yeah. Higher prices, that's something we all feel at the grocery store, at the pump, you know?
Exactly. Trade wars might sound like something out of a textbook, but they have a very real impact on your wallet and maybe even your job.
So what was Trump's goal here? Was it all really about border security and fentanyl, like he said?
Well, he definitely used those as leverage. But if you look at what he's been saying for years, there's a theme. He really believes other countries are taking advantage of the U.S. in trade deals.
Like America's been getting the raw end of the deal.
Exactly. And he sees tariffs as a way to even the score. Bring manufacturing jobs back, make America dominant again.
But does that actually work, though? We saw with the China trade war, tariffs can backfire big time. Didn't other countries just hit back with their own tariffs?
Oh, yeah. They absolutely did. And that can spiral out of control really fast, hurting everyone involved.
So let's talk about Mexico. They seem to have handled this whole thing pretty well. Trump and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum had that very friendly phone call, at least that's what the news said. And then, bam, 30-day pause on the tariffs. What did Mexico have to do to get that?
Well, they agreed to send 10,000 National Guard troops to their southern border to try to slow down migration. And the U.S. promised to crack down on the flow of high-powered weapons into Mexico.
It's a little give and take, but you said this wasn't the first time something like this has happened.
Right. Back in 2019, Mexico also sent troops to the border to avoid tariffs. It makes you wonder, is this going to be the new normal? And if it is, what does that mean for Mexico's independence and their relationship with the U.S. long term?
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem. What happens when the next crisis pops up?
Exactly. And speaking of tricky situations, let's talk about how Canada dealt with this whole tariff tango. That was a whole different story.
Yeah, all the headlines at the time were talking about how uncertain everything felt, almost like Canada was walking on eggshells.
Yeah, there was definitely a different vibe compared to those talks with Mexico. Some people were saying it was because Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau just don't get along.
Interesting. So what did Canada have to agree to in order to get that 30-day pause on the tariffs?
They made a few concessions. One was they said they'd appoint a fentanyl czar to try and deal with the opioid crisis. And they also said they'd label those Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations.
Hold on. Explain that one. What does labeling them as terrorists actually do?
Well, it's complicated. But basically, it makes it easier to freeze their assets and restrict travel for anyone connected to those cartels. It also makes it easier to prosecute them. It's a big deal. But some experts say it could also make it harder to work with Mexico on this.
So there's a lot going on there. But at the end of the day, Canada dodged those tariffs, at least for now.
Right. But this whole thing really showed just how fragile the U.S.-Canada relationship is, especially with Trump's America First trade policy.
It does make you wonder why he took such a different approach with Canada and Mexico. Was it just a personality clash, or was there some kind of strategy behind it?
That's a good question. And it brings us to a bigger point. If you want to understand what Trump's doing with these tariffs, you have to understand his whole view on trade and the global economy.
Okay, let's zoom in for a second. We know he likes tariffs, but what's the big idea behind that?
He sees tariffs as a tool, a way to get what he wants. He said a bunch of times that he thinks tariffs bring in money for the U.S., and he likes to say that other countries are cheating America in trade deals.
So it's like he thinks if another country is doing well, it means America is doing badly.
Exactly. And that has a huge impact on how the U.S. interacts with everyone else, both in terms of the economy and politics.
Okay, before we get too lost in the global picture, let's bring it back down to earth. How did all this tariff drama affect real people and businesses? We were reading an article about that supermarket CEO, right?
Yeah, Stu Leonard Jr. He runs a chain of supermarkets in the Northeast. And when those tariffs were announced, he was scrambling trying to figure out how to keep his business afloat. Like he was thinking about stockpiling tequila from Mexico before the price jumped. Maybe even switching to Norwegian salmon instead of Canadian.
So real problems, real decisions. All because of these trade wars. I bet he wasn't the only one stressing out about it.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And that's a key takeaway for our listeners. What might seem like political games in Washington can actually hit you right in the wallet. It affects your groceries, your job, even the choices you make at the store.
It really shows how connected we all are in this global system.
Absolutely. And speaking of being connected, we can't forget about the big one, China.
Oh, yeah. While those tariffs on Mexico and Canada were put on hold, the ones on China are still hanging over our heads, aren't they? Feels like that's been the elephant in the room for ages now.
It's been a long road. And even though things cooled down with Canada and Mexico, that 10% tariff on Chinese imports is still a real possibility. And on top of that, we've already got a bunch of tariffs on Chinese goods.
Yeah. Didn't Trump say he was going to talk to Chinese President Xi Jinping about it? That's got to be a tense phone call.
For sure. What happens in that conversation could decide whether things get better or worse with this whole trade war.
So paint us a picture. What happens if those tariffs on China actually go into effect? What does that do to the global economy?
It's hard to say for certain, but most experts think it would be bad news. Prices on a lot of stuff we buy would go up. Businesses that rely on Chinese imports would take a hit. And then there's always the chance that China retaliates with their own tariffs.
Sounds like everybody loses.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is this whole tariff thing, this America First strategy, actually working? Is it really making America stronger, or is it just making things more chaotic and uncertain?
I bet that's a question a lot of our listeners are asking themselves, especially the ones who have already been affected by these trade wars.
And that's exactly what I want you to think about. These aren't just some abstract ideas. They have real consequences for people's lives, businesses, and the whole global economy.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about how Trump uses tariffs as a way to get what he wants, how he dealt with Mexico and Canada differently, and now this potential trade war with China. That's a lot to take in.
It is. And while we can't see the future, one thing's for sure, the world of global trade is changing fast, and it's more important than ever to stay informed.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has given us all a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are walking away with a much better understanding of how complicated this all is.
I hope so. Because ultimately, this isn't just about tariffs. It's about understanding how connected we all are and how decisions made by governments can affect the whole world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And to our listeners, stay curious, keep learning, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. We'll see you next time.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all